This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the futures of women with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. It is March 2019 and we're celebrating Women's History Month with an exploration into the future history of women 2030 and beyond. Why 2030? Well, the UN Sustainable Development Goal 5 specifically talks about the development and inclusion of women. And in Providential's prospectus, a trend report on what women futurists are watching. Last year, women futurists talked about watching the increasing trend of women seeking elected leadership and starting their own organizations increasing. And guess what? It's happening. So what else might we expect of the future history of women? In this segment, I speak with Tricia Lustig, or Tricia as she's known to her friends, who is a futurist, well-known author of several tomes about studying the future from strategic foresight to scenario planning. But more importantly, her most recent book is Megatrends and How to Survive Them. So without further ado, let's speak now to Tricia. Tricia, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
Very good today. Thank you.
So I want to start with the 2030 goals because it's so lofty. It always, quote unquote, warms the cockles of my heart. We resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere. Blah, 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 to combat inequalities, to protect human rights, and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Now, you have been out there in the field a long time watching the future. When you hear this as a goal for 2030, what is your response? How do you view this?
Well, I look at it also with I can look into the past and see how things have progressed in my lifetime. And I think societal change like this isn't going to be equal across all the different places in the world. In some places it will go faster, in some places it will go slower. And although we have come a huge long way, we have a long way to go. So I am not sure that by 2030 we will get there. I'm pretty sure we won't yet. But we are seeing fantastic strides forward in girls getting educated, particularly in developing economies. And that is something that warms the cockles of my heart.
Well, and so it should. And ending discrimination of women and girls everywhere, eliminating violence. I want to look at your work on megatrends and how to survive them. What is one megatrend you think that is having a positive impact on this, let's say, optimistic view of how women are emerging?
Well, we looked at 13 different megatrends, and I think the one, there's several of them that would have an impact. Some of it, I suppose, is down to economic activity, and what's happening is more people move up the scale and become middle class. They have more choices. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. I mean, there's downsides to that as well, because obviously, because of what they've seen, they may move more towards consumerism, and that has knock-on effects on global warming. But as they move up the scale and have more choices, education becomes more and more possible. If you don't have electricity, it's hard to study. And if you don't have enough food to eat, you don't get the chance to go to school. Mm-hmm. So as abject poverty decreases, even though there still is abject poverty, in percentage terms, it's much less than it has been in the past. It is getting better. And that's when people get an income that leaves them choices, then one of the choices they make is to educate all their children. And that's a wonderful thing.
So what about the trend of automation? Because you're talking about middle class sort of helping women grow. But as we move through this fourth industrial revolution and we're talking about automation and loss of jobs, do you think that that might have a dampening effect on what is otherwise, let's say, a positive effect of technology?
Well, it rather depends, because the thing is that a specific set of jobs are going to disappear, but
Yeah.
not jobs that require creativity and the things that humans can do that machines can't. There's things around making choices in gray areas that machines just can't yet
But you know, and one of
do.
the questions I wanted to ask you to tackle as you look at this issue of megatrends, are we perhaps rushing to judgment? So, for example, with more women entering politics, for example, and decided on policy, is there any likelihood that we might see a slowing down of this rush to adoption rather of technologies that displace so many workers? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not so sure about that. I think the jury's still out on that, but I think what we will have, because women think differently, is that there will be more of a focus on unintended consequences.
Oh,
Right now, it feels as if the world is just rushing down the path of we should use AI on everything and connected world without considering what the downsides might be.
mhm.
And I think women are better at that. And I'm hoping, because we need that.
Yeah, unintended consequences. Thinking about AI, for example, it was recently brought to my attention that so many of the AI who operate to sort of go serve people are female voices.
Yeah.
Do you think that is a sort of a cultural bias that is sort of still keeping women in their place of serving, even though they are on the AI servers? What are your thoughts about the cultural shift around women's roles?
Wow, I have never considered that. I mean, you're right. My sat nav, uh, your GPS, what I don't know what you call that, is it has a choice. You can have a woman or a man. But yes, I think most people use women. Um, I suspect that is a cultural bias. It's a really difficult thing, and women's voices are frequently, frankly, rather more musical, aren't they?
So you think it's probably just a sensory thing, not so much that the programmers are thinking, well, we need to keep women uh, um, women are perceived as better service people, therefore let's just make the service of Alexa or Alexis or whatever. How are you seeing that?
I mean, I think it's unconscious, some of this stuff, because it's so much a part of how you were socialized that you don't even know. I don't mean we think about it,
Yeah.
but most people don't think about it, and they don't even know.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's true.
And it's not, so it isn't really intentional, other than that's how our society has, you know, socialized most of us. It doesn't matter what country you're from.
Yeah, well, that's true too. So to come back to your mega trends, what other mega trend beside the growing middle class are you looking at that would say have a big impact on how women's roles emerge by 2030?
Well, there's a couple of them, really. There's one about a value shift.
Mm-hmm.
So values are shifting. The different generations have different ways of viewing things.
Mm-hmm.
And when we speak about socialization, as we just were, I think that is changing, and it does change over time. It's not static. But as we move towards the millennials being a larger part of the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
their values will come more to the fore, and their values are different than baby boomers and traditionalists and even Generation X people. So that's one thing that might I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out because we're just watching that still. We've
Mm-hmm.
got another 5 years before it will become more clear which way that trend is going, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's another one around social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
As we have smaller families, as we become more middle class, as people become more educated, what happens to how things work in the family? What happens to how social structures work?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when, excuse me just a second. What do you do when you've only got the nuclear family and you haven't, something goes wrong and you need help? So your parents aren't around, you just got you. There are different things, support structures needed. That may be good for women and it may not. I mean, certainly for me, I didn't have my parents when I brought my children up, and it meant that I was stuck for everything. And that affects what you can do. And how's that going to work? I mean, these are questions. I don't do predictions. I'm looking at what it could be. And I think they could have really good upsides, but they could have downsides as well.
Well, this whole notion of social cohesion, there's this growing worry around rising inequality
Yes.
and its impact on social cohesion. And so, again, in terms of women's roles, for example, as you know, in the media recently, has been a lot of talk about what to do with the returning combatants of women from England who went to fight with ISIS. How do you reintegrate these people? Should they be reintegrated? So this whole idea of women's roles changing, and one idea that I'd like to explore with you, if you don't mind, is the, let's say, possible dystopian side of it. Are we assuming that more women will not, let's say, be on, I'm using ISIS as a figurehead, that more women will not become radicalized as inequality grows, let's say in Europe, especially? Is there an assumption, or is there like a blind spot where that is concerned?
Oh, wow, that's a big one. Because there are so many trends that contribute to it.
Yeah.
And it's, the walls, the us versus them, the lack, I mean, while in developing economies, the middle class is growing, there's a hollowing out of the middle class in mature economies. And that is certainly something that's happening in the UK. So people don't see anything to be hopeful for.
Mm-hmm.
And they're frightened by much of what they do see. So that brings in the piece about building walls, and that brings in the piece about fear of the other, whoever the other is.
Right. Yeah. So in that regard, because we're seeing also a lot of dystopian films, as you well know.
Yeah.
What is your sense of how what I call a normatopian? Is there like space for a normatopia? I'm not, a normatopia is the middle between a utopia and a dystopia of how women will live their lives in 2030. I mean, what will we be looking back on? If we look at 2020 from the vantage point of 2030, what are we looking back on?
Well, some things are going to have to change, but again, it's a trend. We don't know which way it's going to go. I think it could be quite dystopian if it continues along the trajectory it's taking now. But if we can find ways to engage more people in co-creating a future, so I think that's starting to happen with all the women elected into Congress in the US. If that can start to happen and more voices are heard and more diversity is brought in, then we have a real chance of having perhaps better than a normatopia. Perhaps you've always got good and bad, but the more voices we bring in, the better our chances are of getting something that's good for a greater percentage of the people.
Exactly. Well, good for the greater good, so to speak.
Yeah.
On that note, I was very excited about the Future Generations Wellbeing Act that was passed in Wales, and the Commissioner for Future Generations. Has that notion been sort of looked at askance by the people in Scotland and England? I mean, Wales is part of the UK after all. Or is it something that people haven't even taken on board, or do they think of it as crazy? How is that kind of signal of change playing out in the UK?
You don't see much about it.
Interesting.
I don't live very far from Wales. I live, if I go up to a tall hill, I can see Wales.
Wow.
That close. It's about 20 miles. And you don't see much about it. Now that's partly because England is somewhat insular as far as the rest of the UK is concerned. And it may be that in the last month I haven't been looking at any papers, which is the truth, because I was away.
Yeah.
But there's not, I mean, I'm aware of it, but I haven't seen much.
Well, I can tell you from our vantage point over on this side of the pond, but certainly from me, as somebody who follows these things quite closely, I was quite fascinated. And actually, I'm trying to, let's say, pass the word along to some of the young people, the millennials that I know, so we can get them thinking about being advocates around this. Because as you say, you require more voices to be brought into the table. The other thing I am thinking about, and I wanted your commentary on in terms of, again, the future, how is it playing out, this climate strike for the future that these young people, the teenagers are doing in schools? How is the risk, and obviously a young lady, a young teen girl is at the forefront of that. What does that symbolize for you? How are people responding to that?
And here I have to plead, I was out of the country at the time and not reading anything. So I don't actually know what happened here. I have to be honest about that.
Yeah.
And I didn't have access to the internet even. I was in the bush, as it were.
Oh, that's nice.
I mean, it was, and it was warm and sunny. But I mean, I think it's fabulous. I get terribly upset because I think the most important thing that we face today is global warming. That's the trend, not climate change, but our warming climate. And I'm of the generation that kind of made it happen. I'm worried for my children, and we need to do something, and nobody's doing anything. And that's really difficult. How do you make that kind of change across all different countries happen? And I don't have an answer for that. Well, and I think these children are trying to make it happen, and more power to them.
Well, interesting enough, let's let to come back to what you said. You were in the bush. You were out of control. Being in the bush, what did you find in women's lives where you were? How when you think about, I mean, I know you're only a visitor in the space, but looking at it now from a lens of somebody who works as a futurist, how would you see those people in the bush that you were spending time with, the women in that culture, emerging in this reality that is, that they're embedded in?
Well, it was Indonesia, and I worked there 20 years ago. So I have the advantage of being able to see how things have progressed in 20 years.
Yes.
And I was in a part of Indonesia that's not well traveled and quite poor. But compared to 20 years ago, I think 20 years ago, people didn't have enough to eat. They would have months of the year where there wasn't enough to eat. And now they've moved up a level, if you will, if you look at Rosling's levels, and they're probably between 2 and 3. And the problem they face is that there's no safety net. If anything bad happens, somebody needs to be hospitalized, or a lot of people in your family get married and you have to help pay for it, you can be pushed way back into, I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet. So it seems, although people were, I was with somebody, I don't speak Indonesian Bahasa anymore, so I had to have somebody translating, and people were, as people everywhere, still trying to be hopeful.
Okay.
But it seemed very hard to move up the levels, if you will, because there were not too many resources there, and how would they get the money to start a business,
Mm-hmm.
for instance. That's not the way it is all across Indonesia. I mean, we've been traveling there for several years, so other parts of Indonesia are doing better, parts that have more support from the government or parts that have more resources.
Yes.
The part that was very resource poor.
Okay, so again, so come back to the issue of resource poverty. So when you think about the future of women in 2030 and looking at the trends that you're watching, what are some of the things you say, or you would say rather, we should learn from the past in order to inform, let's say, a positive motion forward?
The single most important thing that anyone can do is educate women.
Mm-hmm.
It affects everything else. It affects health. It affects how long people live. It affects population, because if they're educated, they tend to have fewer children. And that in turn affects global warming, because the fewer of us there are, the better the planet could respond. If people are educated, they also tend to have more money, more choices, the ability to look at the climate and say, okay, I can do this small piece, but if everybody did a small piece, it would make a huge difference. They've got the time. If you're struggling to put food on the table and feed your children, you don't have time for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so on that note, to continue, and another question then, as somebody who is watching mega trends and thinking about the 17 global goals, if you had to pick one that you would personally say attach yourself to work on, which one would that be and why?
This was a really tough one, because I think I've got to find them, because I'm terrible. I don't listen to instructions, and I've got to. And it's easy. It's goal number 4: inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all.
Yes.
Because education across the board, it isn't just women, the men need education as well.
Yeah.
And the other one is urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. I don't think you can keep them separate. I mean, that is so imminent a crisis. It is already a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can have one without the other.
Well, yeah. So as we draw to a close, and my thing is that I'm trying to create a global space for conversation. I make an effort to reach people around the world, because I really think we have to be intentional about the stories that we're telling ourselves and the stories we're sharing. So I want you to tell me a headline story from the year 2030 that you would want to see in 2030.
That I would want to see. Oh, there are so many. What I would love to see would be that we are really working hard. Oh, for instance, that we've got our percentage on the energy mix is 80% renewables.
Wow.
I don't know how realistic that is, but 80% renewables, it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it would really cut global warming.
Mm-hmm.
It would really cut us putting more junk into the air.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see that. I can't remember the count. There's a country in Africa that has 68% women in their parliament. I would love to see that. I'd love to see that the representation in parliament represents the population in the country. So however many of whatever it is there. So if there are 50% women, then 50% in our elected bodies. Wouldn't that be fabulous?
Well, I think that's a very good place very good headline, 2 really good headlines. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about these headlines being arriving?
I think we will get a long way there. I don't think we'll be there, and it's only 10 years.
So you're neutralistic.
No, better than neutralistic. No, better than that.
I have to come up with another
One in the middle.
between optimistic and neutralistic.
Yeah, not neutral. It's not going to stay the same. It is going to get better. So that's optimistic. But I don't think we're going to quite have reached what I was saying I'd like to see as a headline in either one of the two.
All right, well, that's fair enough. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Tricia, for sharing this information. I'm really happy that you could take your time to speak to me all the way across the Atlantic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, friends, we have come to the end of another great conversation, and we want to thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. You know, I truly believe that creating the future we want is our shared responsibility, and it is better for us to act as the parent of our future than the child of our past. So seize the day, and as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journeys. Ta-ta!
You have been listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.